Hey travelers, imagine stepping into a towering stone castle where the walls are ice cold. Your breath hangs in the air, and one mistake in the night could mean never waking up. Lords and ladies did not glide into cozy four-poster fantasies. They crawled into fabric caves, slept fully dressed, and huddled with servants like human embers just to keep their blood moving. So before we pull back the bed curtains and expose how people really slept in medieval castles without freezing to death, light your candle, hit like and subscribe, and join us inside the coldest beds in history. On a winter night in the 14th century, a stone castle on a windswept hill did not feel like the cozy refuge modern fantasy often imagines. Its walls were thick, its windows narrow, and the wind pushed through every crack with a chill sharp enough to wake the dead. Yet people slept in such places year after year, not only surviving but often sleeping soundly. To understand how they did it, one can follow a single night in a great household and, step by step, connect that story to what archaeology is, written descriptions, and later observers reveal about real medieval practice. The great hall of a large castle served as the beating heart of daily life, but it was a miserable bedroom. The open hearth at its center or against one wall gave light and some heat, but most of the warmth rose into the smoky air under the rafters. Experiments with reconstructed halls and accounts from later medieval and early modern writers show how inefficient such fires could be. They roasted those who stood close, while people a few paces away still shivered. The arrival of the wall fireplace and chimney in the later Middle Ages counted as a major technical breakthrough, because the fireplace not only warmed the people gathered near it, but radiated heat into the masonry behind and around it. That masonry, sometimes thickened on purpose, could then store warmth for hours after the flames died low. Even so, a hall fire never fully tamed the cold. Heat bled out through unglazed or poorly glazed windows, battered doors, and through the same stone that carried it. Modern historians who worked with preserved castles note that winter temperatures indoors could drop close to freezing. One popular summary of the problem notes that even with a big fire blazing, drafts and the sheer mass of cold masonry meant most people remained chilly unless they were almost touching the flames. This is why the household did not normally sleep scattered around the open hall. Instead, warmth depended on a layered strategy in space, clothing, and bedding. Spatially, the warmest places in a castle were the smaller, more private chambers. By the 13th and 14th centuries, many noble families had withdrawn their sleeping quarters into upper stories and side towers. These chambers were built with fireplaces where possible, or failing that, with portable braziers or fire stands that could be moved close to the bed. Plans and written descriptions of late medieval castles show this shift from communal life in a single hall to a network of heated side rooms that could be shut off from drafts. Within such a chamber, the fight against the cold began not with the fire, but with the walls and floor. Bare stone radiates chill, so households hung heavy textiles wherever they could afford them. These were not only decorative. Medieval tapestry and other wall hangings are repeatedly described by historians of interiors as practical insulation, trapping layers of still air between fabric and stone. Castle studies often remarked that tapestries softened echoes, blocked drafts, and made rooms feel noticeably warmer and more comfortable. Inventories from noble households list large sets of hangings that were taken from residence to residence along with the family. In the imagined chamber, firelight flickers over such textiles. Woolen or silk tapestries hang behind the bed, patterned with hunting scenes or saints. A thick woven rug or matting of plaited rushes lies underfoot, raised above the bare stone to keep feet from the cold floor. In high-status castles, such as royal apartments in France or England, surviving documents mention not only great wall tapestries, but also smaller fabrics used as door curtains and window coverings, all aimed at keeping cold air out and warm air in. The bed itself formed the central engine of warmth. Contemporary descriptions of noble beds in castles and manor houses speak of wooden frames with rope or leather lacing that acted as a springy base, over which lay a stuffed mattress. Writers on medieval domestic life emphasized that bedding filled with feathers or down, where affordable, insulated far better than a simple sack of straw. In reconstructions and in artistic depictions, the bed is usually raised high off the floor, sometimes so high that steps are needed, protecting the sleeper from the cold air that pools near the stones. Around this bed, carpenters constructed tall posts and a canopy frame. Curtains of wool, linen, or a mix of fabrics could be dropped on all sides, converting the sleeping space into a kind of fabric tent inside the stone chamber. Studies of castle interiors point out that such bed curtains served not merely as symbols of rank and privacy, but as crucial devices for trapping the heat generated by bodies and bedding. The combination of canopy, curtains, and thick coverings created a microclimate above freezing rooms, often making the difference between shivering and comfort. As evening deepened on this winter night, servants hurried about that bed, preparing it for their lord and lady. Some carried furs, others armfuls of thick woolen blankets and quilts. Fur coverings, whether of fox, squirrel, lamb, or other animals, appear repeatedly in aristocratic household accounts. They not only signaled wealth, but offered extraordinary warmth, since fur traps air more effectively than woven cloth. Where fur was scarce, households layered multiple woolen blankets and cloaks instead, relying on sheer thickness rather than luxury materials. Before the castle's lord retired, another set of servants visited the fire, lifting stones or bricks from the hearth with tongs and wrapping them in thick cloths. These glowing masses would be carried swiftly to the chamber and slipped between the sheets to pre-warm the bed. Antiquarian accounts of bed warming describe this technique in medieval and early modern households. Later centuries introduced metal bedpans filled with embers and soapstone warmers, but the basic idea remained the same. A small amount of fuel was used to heat something solid, which then slowly released that heat into the bedding. By the time the lord and lady entered their bedchamber, the fire had been burning for hours. The walls shimmered with tapestry, the shutters were closed, and the bed itself had become a small island of stored heat. Yet this was only the first line of defense. Clothing, habits of sleep, and even decisions about who shared that bed all contributed to survival on nights. When ice formed on the inside of window shutters and water froze in jugs left near the wall, warmth in a medieval castle began with the room and the bed, but it did not end there. To step fully into that winter night, it helps to picture what the people themselves wore when they finally lay down. Medieval men and women did not own specialized flannel pajamas. Their night clothing often blurred with their day clothing, and details varied by region, by class, and by century. Yet patterns emerge when written sources, visual depictions, and surviving textiles are read together. In many parts of Europe, people slept in a long linen garment that resembled an undertunic or shirt. Linen breathed in wicked moisture, which mattered in cold interiors where sweat from heavy wool could chill the body once a person lay still. Evidence from early and high medieval Europe suggests that people commonly slept either naked or in a simple linen undergarment. The linen layer helped keep costly outer garments cleaner and also gave a smoother, more comfortable surface against the skin. For a noble couple in a castle chamber, it is reasonable to imagine a clean linen shift, or shirt reserved mainly for bed, changed more often than the outer wool garments that were expensive and time-consuming to wash. Over this base layer, people piled on more if the cold demanded it. Medieval wardrobes, especially in northern regions, were built around wool. Cloaks, mantles, lined hoods, and heavy gowns were designed to trap heat. Surviving garments in modern reconstructions showed just how effective thick-fulled wool can be as an insulator. A single outer gown could weigh several kilograms, and when combined with an undertunic and a cloak, it formed an impressive barrier against the cold. In winter, people sometimes took these layers with them into bed, unfastening belts and loosening laces for comfort. But keeping the warmth of wool close, hands and heads needed protection as well. Cliffs appear in inventories and artwork, and simple woolen caps or coifs covered hair at night. The old saying about losing much body heat through the head exaggerates the exact proportion, but the principle is sound. In an unheated or poorly heated room, covering the head made a clear difference to perceived warmth. Medieval imagery sometimes shows sleeping figures with caps or hoods drawn up, and later household manuals recommend nightcaps, especially for the elderly. The same is true of feet. Woolen hose or stockings, sometimes cross-gartered, and soft indoor shoes or slippers shielded the extremities from cold floors and from the cool chill of contact with the outer parts of the bed. The lord and lady in this castle did not sleep alone in their room in an absolute sense. Servants came and went, tending the fire, checking shutters, and sometimes bedding down on truckle beds or pallets on the floor nearby. Communal sleeping is one of the most firmly attested features of pre-modern Europe. Whole families shared beds, and travelers at inns often found themselves lying beside strangers. A single mattress might hold 3 or 4 people, while additional sleepers lay at the foot, perpendicular to the others. Household accounts and literary descriptions make it clear that for most people, sleeping alone in a private bed was rare. From a thermal perspective, this practice made good sense. Several bodies under the same coverings produce more heat than one. In a curtained bed, especially, the combined warmth of 2 or 3 adults and perhaps a child, or too quickly raised the temperature inside that little tent of textiles. Bed sharing also allowed people to help keep one another warm by pure proximity. Mistresses sometimes slept beside female servants, not only for moral protection in a household full of men, but also in recognition that many bodies together meant less shivering in the small hours of the night. Shared sleeping also made nighttime care practicable, since attendants were already close at hand if a child cried or if the lady woke in pain or distress. Even those who lay on pallets on the floor had some defense. Straw, wool, or feather stuffing formed a barrier between the body and cold stone. The straw mattress, humble as it sounds, was a major improvement over bare rushes or earth, especially when combined with a simple sheet or blanket. Descriptions of medieval and early modern inns mention long rooms where several beds or pallets were set up, each with straw support and shared coverings. The castle household, better resourced than then, offered most of its permanent members something softer than a bare bench, even if only a shared straw bed on boards in a servant's loft. The clothing on these bodies, moreover, did not always come off at night. In the depths of winter, many simply slept in what they had worn through the day, loosening belts and perhaps removing only outer cloaks. Moralists complained about the temptations of the bed and about immodest undressing, which implies that going to bed partly clothed or unclothed did occur, but practice was flexible. On a really bitter night, keeping one more layer on was a rational choice, so the scene in the chamber resolves into many layers. Against a backdrop of stone veiled in tapestry, a tall curtained bed piles wood, rope, mattress, feather or straw filling, and fur into a single warm core. On and around that bed lie bodies wrapped in linen, wool, and sometimes fur, their heat pooled and held by textiles, and by the very fact of sleeping together. Beyond that inner circle, pallets, truckle beds, and benches hold other members of the household, less protected but still benefiting from shared coverlet, from the upward plume of heat from the fire, and from the fact that the room is smaller and better sealed than the echoing hall below. Warmth in castles depended not only on textiles and bodies, but on architecture and the way households arranged themselves inside it. While the lord and lady withdrew to a private chamber with its fireplace, tapestries, and bed curtains, many others slept in spaces where the layout of the castle itself provided heat. In particular, kitchens, bakehouses, and service rooms became vital refuges against the cold. Large hearths for cooking burned through much of the day. Their chimneys drew air powerfully, but the massive masonry around them absorbed and slowly released heat. It is no accident that servant rooms were often built above or beside kitchens and bakehouses. Castle studies note that these upper rooms, though cramped and lacking in privacy, were among the warmest workaday sleeping quarters, benefiting from rising heat and from the absence of large, drafty windows. In some later castles, purpose-built servants' chambers were squeezed into the roof space over such hot rooms, where the roof timbers themselves became gently warmed. The same logic applies to chambers built above stables. The warmth of animals, especially several large horses or cattle in a confined space, created a crude but effective form of underfloor heating. Whether in castles or simple farmsteads, people throughout Europe recognized that barns and byres could be significantly warmer than open yards on winter nights. A groom sleeping in a loft over the horses, wrapped in a cloak and lying on straw, experienced very different conditions from a guard on an exposed wall walk. Consider the lower floors of this castle on the winter night in question. In a corner near the base of a tower, the kitchen fire has been banked, but still glows red, buried under ash. A pot of stew that simmered all day now cools slowly on the trivet. Above the hearth, smoke stains the hood and rafters. In a loft, reached by a narrow stair, several scullions and kitchen maids share 2 pallets laid on planks. The air is heavy with cooking smells and soot, but it is noticeably less cold than in the great hall. The servants here wrap themselves in coarse woolen blankets and patched cloaks, but they do not see their breath in the air as often as the guards on the walls do. Not all castles relied only on open hearths. In regions influenced by German and Central European building traditions, tile stoves and masonry heaters began to appear. These enclosed stoves, often decorated with glazed ceramic tiles, burned fuel in a small fire, then channeled hot air and smoke through a network of flues embedded in the masonry. Once heated, the structure radiated gentle warmth for a long time after the fire went out. Modern summaries of these devices, known in German as Kühlöfen, note that they were developed in the later Middle Ages as a more efficient alternative to open fireplaces, using the thermal mass of brick and tile to store heat. Archaeological work in castles in Denmark, Germany, and elsewhere has identified such tile stoves in noble apartments. Heating technology shaped sleeping habits. A chamber warmed by a masonry stove cooled more slowly than one heated by an open hearth. In such a room, people could move away from the direct line of the fire and still find comfortable sleeping spots. The lord of a castle equipped with such heaters might sleep in a bed placed some distance from the stove, confident that the tiled mass would keep the whole space above freezing. By contrast, in chambers warmed by open fireplaces alone, beds tended to cluster closer to the source of radiant heat, while cold corners became storage rather than sleeping space. Those who had to sleep in harsher conditions developed their own tricks. Guards and soldiers assigned to exterior towers, gatehouses, or wall walks faced the bitterest cold. Their sleeping spaces, if they had them, were often small rooms in the thickness of the wall, with only a tiny window or arrow slit and perhaps a brazier if fuel could be spared. Here, thick cloaks and shared blankets mattered even more than furniture. Men rolled themselves in woolen cloaks that functioned as both outdoor garment and sleeping bag. In some cases they slept sitting, backs to the wall, so they could wake quickly if cold. Fire safety imposed strict limits on how much heat could be brought into the sleeping space. Open flames near straw bedding and timber roofs posed obvious dangers. Chronicles are full of catastrophic fires in towns and strongholds. As a result, the same awareness that made medieval people very cautious with candles in stables and barns also shaped castle sleep. Fires were banked at night, embers covered with ash, and braziers monitored. In some places, regulations restricted fires in upper stories for fear of setting the entire structure alight. The result was a constant tension between the need for warmth and the equally urgent need to avoid disaster. The physical arrangement of doors, shutters, and passages also shaped temperature. Narrow doors created bottlenecks to cold drafts. Heavy wooden shutters closed over windows, sometimes with a layer of oiled cloth or horn behind wooden lattice to reduce wind while admitting a little light by day. Small wall openings or niches allowed candles or small lamps to sit in recesses, where their light and a tiny bit of heat could radiate without exposing the room to a through draft. Restoration work and interpretive material for castle visitors often highlight how closing shutters and hanging curtains could noticeably improve comfort even when the air temperature remained low. In this castle, as the night grows deeper, the architectural hierarchy of warmth becomes clear. At the top, in the lord's chamber, masonry, tapestries, and a well-placed fireplace or stove create a relatively stable, if still chilly, climate behind bed curtains. A step down are the servants' lofts perched above kitchens and storerooms, warmed from below. Lower still are wall chambers and towers where guards huddle in their cloaks and perhaps share a brazier. The hall, though massive, lies cold and dark, its central hearth banked and its benches pushed back. Few choose to sleep there if any other option exists. Warm nights in castles were privileges unevenly distributed. The lord's feather bed and the kitchen lofts benefited from architecture and status. But large households also included grooms, labourers, visiting merchants, low-ranking squires, and other marginal figures who slept in rougher conditions. To understand how people avoided freezing, the historian must look not only at the top of a household, but also at the bottom. Sources on medieval inns and poorer urban households provide valuable analogies. They describe people sleeping on straw spread directly on the floor, on rough pallets raised slightly on boards, or on simple benches lined up shoulder to shoulder. A blog-style survey of medieval and Tudor sleeping practices notes that, in poorer establishments, a basic arrangement might be nothing more than a wooden bench with a rope stretched horizontally at chest height. Travelers would crowd along the bench and hang their arms over the rope to keep from sliding off, then be cleared out in the morning so the room could be washed down. In inns with more resources, straw mattresses and sheets raised off the floor on boards or woven rush mats were offered instead. In castles, similar arrangements appeared in guardrooms, gatehouses, storage lofts, and backstage corners of the household, where status and comfort dipped. Straw was cheap and, when changed reasonably often, provided both cushioning and a significant layer of trapped air between sleeper and stone. A simple tick stuffed with straw might serve several years if regularly refilled and aired. The straw itself was rarely bare. Even poor sleepers used some combination of coarse sheets, blankets, or old cloaks as cover. The quality of textiles mattered less than the number of layers. Many thin layers trap heat more effectively than a single thick one, because each fabric layer holds a thin film of warm air. A groom curled up in a corner with a straw pallet, an old woolen cloak, and a spare horse blanket stood a better chance of a decent night than a person lying on bare planks with only a thin sheet. Rodents and insects posed another problem. The well-known advice in later periods to keep bedding tight and free of bedbugs has roots in much older concerns. Accounts of sleeping on rushes or straw often mention the need to change or air them regularly. A piece on the history of beds points out that straw mattresses in inns, monasteries, and simple homes were periodically replaced, both to improve comfort and to discourage vermin that nested in old bedding. The better-managed castles could keep their bedding cleaner than crowded city slums or the cheapest travelers' lodgings. But even there, people accepted a certain level of pests as the cost of having any bedding at all. In cold weather, however, insect activity slowed, which offered a small but real relief. The cold also shaped how people positioned themselves in a room. They avoided the direct line of drafts. Sleeping pallets slid under tables or into alcoves, where furniture and masonry broke the wind. People gathered near interior walls rather than outer ones, since exterior stones radiated the chill of the night sky. In timber-framed upper floors, the air might be marginally warmer than at ground level, so servants sometimes preferred lofts, attics, or gallery spaces even if these lacked proper furniture. A few steps up could mean a noticeable difference in the feel of the air. Barns, stables, and byres added another layer of adaptation. The heat of animals, especially horses and cattle, could raise the ambient temperature a little in enclosed spaces. Grooms sometimes slept in lofts over stables, wrapped in cloaks on straw piles. There, the combination of animal warmth from below, bedding under and over the body, and shelter from the wind made the difference between a miserable night and a survivable one. The same basic arrangement appears in accounts of rural life beyond castles, and there is no reason to doubt that castle workers used similar tactics when allowed. There is also evidence that people adapted their expectations of sleep to the climate. Historians of sleep, notably Roger Eckertz and others, have traced a pattern of segmented sleep in pre-industrial Europe, where people commonly spoke of a first sleep in the early part of the night, followed by a waking interval, and then a second sleep toward morning. During the waking interval, people prayed, talked quietly, tended fires, checked on children or animals, and sometimes moved around to restore circulation before returning to bed. In a cold castle, this segmented pattern had practical advantages. Fires could not safely be left blazing unchecked all night in rooms cluttered with wooden furniture and straw bedding. Instead, hearths were banked and embers covered, which meant heat slowly declined after the household settled. The waking interval between first and second sleep gave people a natural opportunity to poke through the ash, rebuild the fire a little, adjust bed curtains, or fetch an extra blanket. A groom in the stable might rise around midnight, feel the chill, throw more bedding over a foal, check water buckets for ice, and briefly stamp his feet or walk a short distance before lying down again. Accounts of communal sleeping reinforce the picture of an active night. Modern summaries of medieval and early modern sleeping customs note that entire families could occupy one bed, with parents in the middle and children arranged by age and sex around them, while servants slept at the foot or on nearby pallets. In such crowded conditions, one person waking to stir the fire or use the latrine often disturbed others, leading to bursts of quiet conversation or simple wakefulness, or within a bed that remained physically warm because so many bodies lay together. In the imagined castle, Grooms in the stables doze shortly after sunset, wrapped in cloaks on straw near their horses. Sometime after midnight, they rouse for the interval between first and second sleep, check the animals, add a little fodder, and perhaps crack open a shutter briefly to let some of the heavy smell escape. In a guardroom, a low-ranking watchman wakes, prods the brazier to coax a little more heat, and then hands over to another before curling up again. Their sleep is practical rather than luxurious, knitted together from whatever warmth they can borrow from animals, straw, and cloth. These rougher sleeping arrangements underline an important point. Medieval adaptations to cold relied more on social and behavioral strategies than on sophisticated technology. People slept together, layered their clothing, organized their households so that the warmest spaces went to those whose wakefulness mattered most, and accepted a degree of discomfort as normal. Within that framework, even those far from the featherbed developed ways to avoid freezing outright. Returning to the castle chamber of the lord and lady, one finds that warmth shaped not only who slept where, but also how intimacy and hierarchy unfolded inside the bed itself. The great bed in a noble chamber was as much a stage for social relations as it was a piece of furniture. Shared sleeping, while practical for heat, also reflected bonds of kinship, service, and hospitality. Modern historians and popular explainers of medieval sleep emphasize that beds were communal places. In many families, parents slept in the center of the bed, with children around them in a fixed pattern, often with the couple in the middle. The daughters arranged on the side nearest the wall, and the sons on the outer side, youngest closest to the mother. That pattern appears in accounts from Ireland and other parts of Europe and probably had variations, but the underlying idea was stable. The bed held the core family, not just the married couple. In a castle, similar patterns appeared when relatives came to stay. A widowed sister or cousin might share the lady's bed, bringing with her a personal servant who slept at the foot or on a nearby pallet. Children might be added on cold nights so that everyone benefited from the shared warmth. Moralists worried that too many bodies in one bed created possible temptations and confusion about proper boundaries. Guests experienced the thermal logic of aristocratic hospitality. Noble households prided themselves on offering visiting dignitaries good beds, warm rooms, and plentiful bedding. A detailed article on the value of beds notes that, in the later medieval and early modern periods, a bed and mattress could represent a very significant investment, sometimes a quarter of the value of an ordinary house. For great lords, this meant maintaining a stock of high-quality beds, mattresses, sheets, blankets, and furs reserved for guests. When an ambassador or high-ranking knight arrived in winter, he might be given a chamber with its own fireplace, or at least a place in a room warmed by the main chimney, and bed curtains to keep the night air at bay. Less exalted retainers, squires, or clerks might share beds, 3 or 4 to a mattress in adjacent rooms. Inns provide a particularly vivid parallel. Writers who synthesize evidence about inns describe rooms containing up to a dozen beds, each holding 3 or 4 people. Travelers were expected to share beds with strangers, and there were informal rules about being a considerate bedfellow, such as not hogging the covers or pushing the other person toward the cold edge. In cheaper establishments, space might be even more crowded, with shared pallets or the rope bench arrangement already mentioned. While a great castle was grander than an inn, the underlying constraints were similar. To heat every room to a comfortable temperature was impossible. Instead, heat was concentrated in fewer spaces where multiple people could share it. The intimacy of bed sharing sometimes carried social risks. The history of communal sleep notes that mistresses sometimes shared their beds with female servants, both as a mark of favor and as a way to protect the servants from the unwanted advances of male members of the household. Servants might sleep at the foot of the bed, no matter what other activities occurred there. Yet the same arrangements gave chosen servants access to warmth and security that others lacked. From the point of view of thermal comfort, the great bed functioned like a small furnished room inside the larger chamber. The wooden frame and curtains created walls. Inside this micro-room, exhaled breath and body heat slowly raised the temperature. A difference that matters greatly in a building that hovers near freezing. In the imagined castle, the lord and lady lie finally at rest, surrounded by this architecture of warmth. Their linen nightclothes separate skin from coarse wool. Above them hangs a canopy embroidered with heraldic devices. Around them fall thick curtains, perhaps lined in contrasting fabric. At their feet, a small servant bed, a low truckle on wheels, has been pulled close. A trusted attendant sleeps there, with an easy call if the lady wakes in the night or if the lord needs something. Outside the curtains, the fire on the hearth burns low, but its earlier heat still radiates from the warmed stone. If the curtains are drawn back for a moment, the contrast is sharp. The air near the center of the room feels brisk. The flagstones are cold underfoot. In the corners, where wall and floor meet, ice might form on very cold nights. Inside the curtains, by contrast, the air is still and relatively mild. The coverings hold in warmth, not only from the lord and lady, but from the servant at their feet, and perhaps a small child nestled between them during an illness or a fear-filled night. This pattern of nested spaces helps explain why people could sleep in buildings that, is judged by modern standards, were almost unbearably cold. The castle did not need to be uniformly warm. Instead, warmth was organized. The bed was warmer than the room warmer than the passage warmer than the courtyard. People moved through these layers as their duties required, but spent the longest, most vulnerable hours of night in the innermost and best protected zone available to their rank and role. The castle does not exist in isolation. It stands within a broader medieval world that faced recurring climatic challenges. Periods of colder weather in the later Middle Ages, especially from the 14th century onward, brought harder winters to much of Europe. In such conditions, the tactics used inside stone walls became ever more important. Castles were part of a larger family of pre-modern solutions to cold that appear around the world. One striking feature of medieval European responses is the reliance on textiles as portable insulation. Unlike fixed architectural changes, textiles could be added or removed as needed. Historical surveys of tapestry production explain that in the Middle Ages, large wall hangings were used as a form of insulation to protect cold stone walls from damp and to keep interiors warmer in winter. Tapestries were draped on the walls of palaces and castles and sometimes used as door and window curtains. They were expensive, but they had several advantages. They could be taken down, folded into canvas bags, and transported when courts moved. Many royal households maintained entire departments devoted to the care and movement of such hangings. Inside the bed, textile technology evolved as well. Feather and down filling, especially among the wealthy, provided better thermal performance than straw. Sheets could be made of finer, smoother linen. Over time, quilted coverlets and lined bedspreads appear more often in surviving descriptions. Even when most of the castle remained cold, these layers created pockets of genuine comfort. A detailed popular article on the history of beds notes that by the late Middle Ages, wealthy households could have several layers of bedding, sometimes including feather beds placed on top of firmer straw mattresses, multiple sheets, blankets, and fur throws. Elsewhere in the world, different architectural solutions emerged to the same basic problem. In northern China, the Kong bed stove developed as a heated masonry platform used for living and sleeping. It is essentially a long brick or clay platform built over a maze of flues, heated by the exhaust from a nearby cooking or heating fire. The mass of masonry stores heat and releases it slowly so that people can sleep on a warm surface long after the fire is out. In Korea, the Ondol underfloor heating system used flues under a thick masonry floor to distribute heat from a kitchen or room furnace across an entire room, keeping the floor and air warm for hours. These Eastern systems function in a way similar to European masonry heaters and tile stoves. A masonry heater, often covered in ceramic tiles and known as a Kochelephon in German-speaking lands, captures heat from a short, intense fire and then radiates it steadily over a long period. Modern descriptions of these heaters emphasize that the maze of flues inside the masonry allows hot gases to transfer most of their heat to the structure before reaching the chimney. In Central European castles and townhouses, such stoves became central features of living rooms in the later Middle Ages and early modern period, offering a much more efficient source of steady heat than open fireplaces alone. Medieval European castles did not adopt kongs or andal, but the comparison is useful. It shows that stone and brick can be turned into allies instead of enemies in the fight against cold. In the castle on the hill, The main methods remained open fireplaces, simpler masonry stoves where they were known, and heavy textile insulation. But the underlying principle was shared with these other cultures. Heat is stored in mass and moderated by layers. The challenge inside a castle was that military architecture, with its need for thick defensive walls and limited openings, was not primarily designed around efficient heating. The domestic arrangements had to work within those constraints. Within Europe, regional differences mattered. In the Mediterranean, milder winters and different building traditions meant that some fortresses could rely more on sunlight, thick walls, and limited heating, although mountain castles still faced significant cold. In northern and central Europe, the combination of damp and low temperatures made fires and textiles more urgent. Tile stoves, fur-lined garments, and layered bedding show up frequently in the material and documentary record of German, Polish, Scandinavian, and Baltic elites. The gradual spread of masonry stoves into castles and large houses in these regions improved comfort significantly for those who had access to them. Despite these variations, the underlying principles remained similar. People did not expect their entire home to be warm. They expected certain places to be warm enough. The hearth, the bed, and certain favored corners of rooms became anchors in the thermal landscape. At night, this meant arranging sleep so that each person had access to at least one such anchor, whether that meant lying beside a fire, on a heated platform, or under shared coverings. In the castle on the hill, the effect of these broader patterns is palpable. On the coldest nights, additional wall hangings are brought out of storage and hung in drafty corridors. Furs that normally serve as riding gear are spread over beds. Door curtains are drawn more carefully. The steward balances the household's supply of firewood and charcoal against the need to keep certain rooms habitable. Over the course of the winter, rooms are opened and closed, occupants shifted, and duties reshuffled to take advantage of spaces that turn out to be warmer than expected. Because of their orientation to the sun or their proximity to warmed masonry, the constant adjustment reflects a lived understanding of microclimates inside the castle. Stairwells trap rising warm air. South-facing rooms with small windows gather more sun by day. Towers exposed to the wind are avoided for sleep if other options exist. When modern visitors walk through ruinous castles and feel the bite of the wind through broken walls and empty windows, they often struggle to imagine anyone sleeping there. Yet when those openings are glazed or shuttered, when tapestries hang and fires burn, when beds with curtains stand ready, and when people cluster in the right places, the experience is transformed. To understand how medieval people experienced sleep in castles, it is useful to look not only at the physical arrangements, but at the meanings they attach to cold and warmth. Medical theory, religious practice, and social attitudes all colored the way people thought about the night. People were not passive victims of climate. They interpreted cold through the lenses of humoral medicine, piety, and social order. Medieval medicine, grounded in the ancient theory of the four humors, associated cold and damp with specific imbalances in the body. In this system, health depended on a proper balance of four humors, each associated with qualities such as hot, cold, dry, and moist. Physicians advised patients to avoid sudden chills, particularly after exertion or bathing, because cold and damp were thought to thicken certain humors and weaken digestion or vitality. At the same time, they warned against overheating the body, especially the head, during sleep, since excessive heat could disturb dreams, encourage lust, or provoke harmful vapors rising from the stomach to the brain. As a result, the ideal sleeping environment in medical advice was moderate. Some medieval and early modern writers recommended a cool chamber, but a warm bed, a combination that suited humoral theory. A brisk room air was not considered harmful if the sleeper's body was properly covered and the head was not in a direct draft. That description maps closely onto the conditions in a castle chamber, where the space beyond the bed curtains could be cold enough for breath to show, while inside the bed the air remained mild. The noble couple in such a chamber therefore lay in an arrangement that would have seemed medically appropriate by contemporary standards. Religious practices intersected with this world of night and cold. Monks and nuns in monastic communities kept canonical hours through the night, rising from their beds at set times to pray. Their dormitories were often unheated or only sparsely heated, both as a matter of austerity and because of the risk of fire in large timbered structures. Accounts of monasteries describe the calefactory, a warming house that was sometimes one of the only rooms in a complex with a permanent fire. where monks could briefly thaw themselves after hours spent in unheated cloisters, churches, and dormitories. A modern reflection on monastic life notes that, by medieval standards, even a fireplace in the warming room was a luxury. Monks typically slept in their wool habits on straw mats over rough planks in cold dormitories, reminding us that acceptance of cold as a spiritual discipline could go quite far. For lay people in castles, religious observance could alter the rhythm of the night without demanding the same degree of austerity. Chaplains might rise for vigils, lighting lamps in small oratories tucked into the castle fabric. The faint light and sound of chanting could reach nearby chambers, reminding sleepers of the spiritual dimensions of the night. For some, cold was linked mentally with trial and testing. Enduring it patiently, especially during fasts or penitential seasons, had value. Complaints about winter exist in abundance, but so do metaphors that associate physical warmth with divine favor or earthly privilege. Socially, warmth in sleep mirrored hierarchy. The best heated and best furnished beds went to those at the top of the household order. The further one descended the ladder of status, the more reliance there was on shared coverings, adaptive behavior, and simple endurance. A modern explanatory piece on domestic life in castles points out that kings and lords slept in solas, or private chambers, with fires, while servants often slept in the hall near the main hearth, and poorer people in single-room houses slept near the only fire source they had. At the absolute bottom, some people slept without guaranteed shelter at all, under carts in castle yards, or huddled in outbuildings, if no space was available inside. The castle, even as a fortified refuge, could not eliminate poverty or its consequences. Within the noble family itself, the bed could be a place of both comfort and tension. Marital relations, childbirth, illness, and death often played out on or near the great bed. Midwives and physicians were summoned there, candles were brought, fires stirred, curtains drawn back or closed as necessary. The same textiles that provided warmth also framed scenes of joy and grief. When people remembered a night of terrible cold later in life, they might remember it because a child was born or a relative died in that chamber, and because the cold seemed to press in from the world outside, while the small circle around the bed tried to hold warmth and life. The memory of cold was sharpened by its seasonal rhythm. Winters ended. Spring returned. Tapestries were taken down or rearranged. Bedding was beaten and aired, and life moved more freely through courtyards and open passages. Writers and later commentators sometimes mention the first night when additional furs were no longer needed, or the first evening when doors could be left partly open without everyone crowding closer to the fire. That contrast made the strategies of winter nights seem both ordinary and remarkable. In this context, the fact that people did not freeze to death in large numbers in castles is less surprising. They lived inside a mental and material system in which cold was expected and managed rather than eliminated. Sleep took place inside envelopes of warmth created by architecture, textiles, and human bodies, nested inside a larger structure that remained, by modern standards, very cold. Their medical theories explained cold and warmth in terms of humors and balance. Their religious practices taught them to endure hardship with patience. Their social structures ensured that some benefited from greater warmth than others. But even those at the margins were not entirely without protection. As dawn approaches in the 14th century castle, the night's battle against cold draws to a close. The fire in the Lord's chamber is now a bed of embers. The air is cold enough that breath is visible again beyond the bed curtains. Yet inside the great bed, under layered sheets, blankets, and furs, the noble couple and their attendant have endured the night without frostbite or serious distress. In the kitchen loft, scullions stir as renewed activity around the hearth begins to heat the air again. Guards on the walls stamp their feet and dream of a midday nap by the fire. The household has passed another winter night, thanks to a web of practices that, seen together, amount to a coherent system of survival. At the heart of that system lies an understanding, partly conscious and partly traditional, of where heat comes from and how to keep it. Fireplaces, chimneys, and stoves provided concentrated sources of heat that could be transferred into stone, tile, and air. Tapestries, hangings, shutters, and door curtains reduced the rate at which that hard-won warmth escaped. Beds, with their raised frames, stuffed mattresses, and curtains, created small enclosed climates where bodies could warm the air and then rest within it. Clothing, especially layered wool and linen, protected those bodies as they moved between warmer and colder zones. The distribution of warmth reflected power and necessity. Those whose alertness or status mattered most slept in the best protected spaces. Others slept where they could, using every available trick, from sharing beds to sleeping above kitchens, to make their rest bearable. Even the humblest straw pallet in a corner of a stable took advantage of animal heat, bedding, and shelter from the wind. Archaeological and documentary studies of castles make clear that although such buildings were difficult to heat, people used architectural niches, hangings, and human arrangements to create local pockets of comfort within a generally chilly shell. From a modern perspective, the ingenuity of these solutions emerges most clearly when visiting restored or conserved castles in winter. Heritage organizations that interpret medieval life often highlight the raw cold that visitors feel through stone walls and in high halls, then point to heavy tapestries, reconstructed beds, wooden shutters, and banked hearths as tools medieval people used to transform at least part of that environment into something survivable. Guides and interpretive panels sometimes quote the remark that tapestries acted like blankets for the walls, allowing a fire to heat the room more efficiently than bare stone alone. This story also offers a reminder about the limits of comfort in the past. Medieval castle dwellers did not aspire to modern indoor temperatures. They accepted cold hands and faces, icy stone floors, and frosty breath as part of life for several months of the year. Their concern was not to banish cold entirely, but to prevent it from killing them or making them too weak to perform their duties. Sleep could be deep and restorative even when noses were cold, as long as the core of the body was protected and the bed was reasonably dry. The layering of bedclothes, the sharing of warmth, and the focused use of heated spaces all served that end. The historian's task, in tracing how people slept in such conditions, is to resist both romanticizing and exaggerating hardship. Castles were not cozy storybook homes, nor were they uninhabitable iceboxes. They were complex machines for managing power, security, and resources, including heat. The strategies described here, grounded in surviving buildings, written accounts, inventories, and comparative evidence from other cultures, show how ordinary human ingenuity adapted to thick stone walls and harsh winters. For the individual sleepers, much of this complexity simply formed the background of life. The cook's boy did not think in terms of microclimates and thermal mass when he climbed into his straw pallet above the kitchen. He knew only that it was warmer there than in the courtyard. The noblewoman pulling bed curtains closed against the draught did not talk about insulation. She knew that the bed felt snugger when the curtains met, yet by carrying out such acts night after night, people who lived in castles made those buildings into workable homes. As the sun finally lifts above the horizon, in this imagined winter scene, shutters open one by one. The great hall fills with pale light. Fires are stirred to new life. Tapestries glow with color they did not show by firelight alone. The great bed curtains are drawn back. Their world taught them how to sleep inside the cold, wrapped in layers of architecture, cloth, and companionship that turned hostile nights into something endurable.